Based off a James Baldwin novel, If Beale Street Could Talk is an observation of life as an African American in the early 1970s, though it carries the knowledge that many of its themes have echoed from the beginning of slavery in America to the present day. Beale Street balances the universal with the personal. The film is shot in an impressionistic, floaty style, characters voicing over the imagery, the camera going in and out of focus as tensions rise to the point that the subject is sometimes obliterated by blurred colors. This gentle camera work is matched elegantly with a soft, ambient score. This is the Great American Movie of 2018, a film that carries a certain density as it attempts to tackle the idea of race in America. It wears importance as a label, but it does so with worthy craftsmanship. Characters are specific people on camera, but talk in a wider breadth as voiceover, commenting on everything from police violence to the way different types of people treat black workers in retail. Like Barry Jenkins' previous film, The Absolutely Astounding Moonlight, Beale Street finds moments of hope in the darkest corners. With the backdrop of an unfair criminal accusation, the characters of Beale Street keep finding reasons to keep going. Whether it be the birth of a child, catching up with a long-missing friend, or having your first moments of intimacy, life offers so many moments of beauty. Shoplifters is an exploration of what it means to be a family. A man and young boy run across a girl who is an obvious victim of abuse, essentially kidnapping her and making her a member of their large, makeshift family. It's unclear how any individual member knows each other, but there's this undeniable sense of community that brings them together. Director Kurita never pretends to have the answers. Osamu and Nobuo provide the love of good parents, but never the security. Questionable facts are subtly alluded to, until they boil to the surface. This is a family teetering on the edge of collapse. But this is not a despairing movie. These are people who find the drive to push on. Distinct moments of beauty occur. The building of a snowman, a surprising connection in a questionable club. Even in poverty, life can offer brief moments of warmth. These characters aren't merely figures representing the impoverished, but wondrously unique people. In Shoplifters, everyone has something to hide. Kurita slowly pulls back on personal secrets, building to an immense moment of release as everything crashes at once. In the end, how stable can a family be without a true sense of trust? These are people stealing at the idea without any ability to commit. Drive does not equal capability, as sad as that can be. The sole documentary to crack my top 10 for the year, Minding the Gap, follows 3 skateboarders who live in Rockford, Illinois. But like many great documentaries, its surface subject matter gives way to something else, and the dark heart at the center of this is the horror of domestic abuse. Minding the Gap operates from the ground level, being the personal project of one of the 3 people who serve as subjects. Bing Glue grew up with an abusive stepfather, and his friends have similar stories. Featuring footage from several years, Minding the Gap is a gentle observation as 3 young men navigate adulthood as they cope with their past. Part of what makes the film hit so hard is how visibly Zach has fallen into that abusive cycle. Considering how he's willing to behave on camera, it's a nightmare to imagine what he does while alone. For the other 2, it's a backstory they strive to avoid, but for Zach, it's simply how he learned to operate. Minding the Gap is an exploration of how young men cope with adulthood when their concept of masculinity is so tainted by violence. Where skaters are typically portrayed as hoodlums, Minding the Gap sees the hobby as a necessary escape. The original Paddington was already perhaps the best live-action children's movie since Babe, and the sequel takes everything and pushes it to further heights. There's a certain aesthetic appeal to these movies. Matching color and symmetry is utilized by Wes Anderson. But Paddington drops that director's dry humor, instead offering something charming in its utmost sincerity. Paddington is delightful in his antics, always well-meaning despite his tendency to land himself in trouble. He plays like a modernized Chaplin, obliviously wandering into predicaments. But where the original Paddington was largely feel-good, Paddington 2 is tinged with moments of bleakness. This film is an almost direct confrontation of the Brexit movement, sending the immigrant Paddington off to prison for a crime he did not commit. It is a perfect example of how to address serious issues in children's media, the type of story that I imagine would make Mr. Rogers proud. The film never accepts despair. Paddington brings color and hope to the lives of the prisoners. This is a call for kindness in a world that sometimes feels hopeless. Paddington succeeds by eschewing typical modern irony, exuding the goodness it so gracefully preaches. It offers everything a quality family film should. A playful, heartwarming story that explores real emotional depths, while also putting in serious effort to be stylistically pleasing. Where many family films cut corners due to the supposed simplicity of their target audience, Paddington 2 makes sure to offer something of true artistic merit. There are 3 films distributed by A24 in this top 10, and all 3 are marked by an oppressive sense of discomfort. What stands out about 8th grade is that it manages that unease simply by diving deep into the everyday life of a preteen girl. 8th grade has no grand narrative arc. This is a slice of life much like the previous year's Lady Bird. Kayla is simply trying to survive the last 2 weeks of 8th grade. She makes inspirational YouTube videos that no one watches, featuring messages she aspires to but fails to follow. Despite being only 14, Elsie Fisher gives one of the strongest performances of the year. Kayla is a girl constantly pushing a confidence she doesn't truly have, and Elsie perfectly captures the anxiety below the surface. The screenplay is an absolute masterpiece, perhaps the best of 2018. You can trace the connections between writer and director Bo Burnham and the story he's telling, despite the age and gender difference. Experiencing success at a young age, Burnham understands that pubescent drive to perform, to hide the inner self. Where many similar works can come with an air of condescension, 8th grade goes to great lengths to truly represent these kids, grit and all. With a similar rhythm to his comedy specials, Burnham perfectly juxtaposes angst with the dorky charm of childhood ambition. We've been going through a bit of a horror movie renaissance, and a lot of those movies seem to be releasing through A24. Hereditary almost feels like a mirror image of one of their earlier releases, the puritanical The Witch, where the witch largely engaged with the horrors from the era it emulates. Hereditary takes similar family dynamics and shifts the focus from religious hysteria to mental health. Hereditary is so effective because it blurs the line between internal and external factors. As the movie goes on, it's easy to lose focus on the cause. Are the horrors of Hereditary the result of unrelenting outside forces, or is this a family disintegrating through a lapse of mental health? How much of this story is filtered through the questionable minds of distraught people as they fail to cope? Hereditary plays with symbolism, culminating in a finale that works as literally as it does metaphorically. Hereditary is really tied together by the performance of Toni Collette as the mother of the family. She exudes stress in every scene, capturing the frenzy of losing grasp of the world, paranoid suspicions turning to outbursts. There's a certain point where a switch is flipped in her performance, and the result is stellar. Hereditary is an unbearably oppressive horror film, including one of the most brutal sequences I have witnessed in a relatively mainstream film. Alongside Get Out, Hereditary becomes a rare modern masterpiece of horror by merging the real and imaginary. Into the SpiderVerse leaped out of nowhere and became not only my favorite animated film of 2018, but possibly my favorite superhero movie of all time. Where most other comic book films translate the lore into more straightforward pieces of cinema, Into the SpiderVerse puts so much effort into capturing the visual appeal of its source material. Similar to works such as Hausu and Scott Pilgrim, Into the Spider-Verse almost entirely throws out the notion of cinematic realism, opting towards the stylish and colorful. Every image of this film is full of life. Beyond just the visual design, Into the Spider-Verse makes perfect use of editing to match the beats of a comic book. Spider-Verse sees beyond the narrative of its source to the raw elements, translating both perfectly to the screen. The story is loose and fun, playing as a meta-commentary on a franchise that now has 4 distinct film universes, while similarly remarking upon the idea of finding oneself among a group of like-minded people. The narrative hits a sweet spot by latching onto where Miles Morales differs from the other Spider-Men, observing a father-son relationship that hits on themes such as the necessity of secrecy, even among those you trust most. Into the Spider-Verse is a roller coaster of stylistic and emotional whiplash, a rare adaptation that captures the feeling of its source as much as the story, setting a high bar for any future comic book film. First Reformed is a study in many things: faith, masculinity, identity. Reverend Ernst Toller begins as an already broken man, eloquently hiding it with his appearance as a clergyman. His concept of self quickly unravels as he's introduced to an aspiring eco-terrorist. This is a story of self-radicalization, keenly exploring the concept through a seemingly upright member of American Christian society. Schrader puts an often discussed but often poorly understood concept into a more immediate language, suggesting that terrorists come into being not simply through religious indoctrination, but a selfish desire to impact the world in some visible way. Ethan Hawke gives perhaps the best performance of the year as Reverend Toller, perfectly capturing a sense of fragility even as he's put on a certain pedestal. Despite his increasingly alarming behavior, we sympathize because we see a man being shattered by an uncaring world. Director Paul Schrader wears his influences proudly. A reverend keeping a journal through a dire year had to have been pulled straight from Bresson's Diary of a Country Priest, while the increasing sense of despair falls more in line with Bergman's Winter Light. But the film I find myself comparing this to the most is one of Schrader's own. Much like Mishima, this is an exploration of unchecked righteousness. Like Hereditary, First Reformed hits with a visceral unease. The atmosphere is unbearably dense at times. A sense of hopelessness permeates the experience, and it rises into a stellar conclusion. Surrealist master Yorgos Lanthimos appears on the surface to be tackling something outside his usual fare, abandoning modern fears to visit British royalty. But this is very much a Lanthimos film, in all his darkly comic dread. The Favourite is a personal war with the backdrop of an actual war. As the British battle the French, so do Sarah Churchill and Abigail for the favour of the Queen. Their struggle is lopsided. Sarah vies for political power, while Abigail mainly wants her honour restored, but they are equally driven. This is made all the more messy by Queen Anne, an eccentric who seems easily convinced by whoever happens to be in her presence at the current time. Lanthimos isn't merely satisfied by shooting a period piece. As much as he abides by the elaborate costumes and political intrigue, he is likewise invested in tearing at the roots. Dance sequences are distinctly modern, while dialogue carries an acerbic bite. This is vulgar, both as a criticism of the time it observes and as a deconstruction of the typically prim and proper genre. Perhaps more key than Lanthimos' style is the performance of the 3 leads. Emma Stone and Rachel Weisz play perfect foils. Stone's Abigail barely concealing her manipulative nature, while Weisz's Sarah maintains a sense of dignity despite her comparable ambitions. But it's Olivia Colman as the sometimes baffling queen that steals the show. The Favourite, much like Lanthimos' earlier works, finds the perfect balance between brutal humor and a truly palpable sense of dread. It's fitting that the most iconic scene of Roma is a mundane trip to the beach turned terrifying as the tide rushes in. The film as a whole works much like this sequence. Roma starts slow, painting itself to be the type of plotting art film most people dread. There are hints of outside forces at play, but Roma stays centered on the maid Cleo, through her everyday activities. At a certain point, these outside forces break in. What once seemed distant is now immediate. Roma establishes its stakes before applying them. It's a wave we see coming, but we convince ourselves that we're at a safe elevation until it pulls us out to sea. Inner turmoil is matched by outside violence, as Cleo navigates pregnancy during a revolution. Every image of Roma is perfectly considered. This is a master study in framing. So many sequences are shot in deep focus, Cuarón's juxtaposition of the foreground and background, the type to make any Renoir fan swoon. Equally essential to the film is the long take. These extended sequences allow us to share such feelings as being abandoned in a theater by showing how excruciating the realization can feel. Roma is the best film of 2018 because it so perfectly blends technique and narrative. Cuarón turns everyday stress colossal through unrelenting camera work. This is a story crafted to work only through the most expert level of craftsmanship, exemplifying the type of emotional resonance only possible with the immediacy of cinema. No other medium can capture the building dread of simply watching a disaster unfold.